good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this plenary. This plenary is sponsored by the International Peace Research Association Foundation, and we have 5 of our scholars here that were funded by Peace Research grants through the foundation. And just so you know, the foundation is a nonprofit that's housed in the U.S., but we're very international. Our board is from all over the world. Just so you know, when we plan a meeting, it's in 12 time zones. And so we have to be very careful when we plan our board meetings. We are a separate organization from IPRA, but we coordinate in so many ways. We provide travel grants to this IPRA conference. We provide Sinish fellowships for women who are studying peace, either a master's or a PhD program. And then we have this program of peace research grants, which we fund twice a year. So these are scholars who have all received peace research grants in the past, and they've all completed their work now. And so I want you to hear from them, not me. And so I'm going to be turning it over to them, but first I'm going to do a brief introduction for each one of them, and then they're going to talk about the research project that they did for us. So I'm going to go direct down the line so you can know who's going to be speaking. So Susan Brewer-Osario is an assistant professor of political science and Latin American studies at the University of Arizona. She researches conflict and peace building, and her current project focuses on collective reintegration of former combatants in Colombia. Peter Cousins is a PhD researcher at the University of Granada, Spain, focusing on history and civilian diplomacy of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. He also serves as vice president of IPRA between 2017 and 2022. Isana Lisi is a visiting scholar at the University of Cambridge. She holds a PhD from Transitional Justice Institute, Ulster University. Her PhD project focused on prospects of transitional justice in the ongoing Kurdish conflict from a victim-centered and grassroots-oriented approach. Isana is the co-founder of Demos Research Association, where she has been involved in research projects on peace, gender, and transitional justice. She is currently a researcher at the Center for Rights and Justice at Nottingham Trent University. Rajiv Tamsina is an assistant professor of conflict, peace, and development studies at University and a co-investigator of Mobile Arts for Peace map. He leads Asher Nepal citizen-led assessment in Nepal. Colleen Elena O'Brien received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and is now a postdoc researcher at the University of Saarland in Germany. Her research focuses on reintegration of ex-combatants, indigenous language in Colombia and Indonesia, and ethnographic filmmaking. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to each one of them, and they're going to explain their research projects to you.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Susan Brewer-Osario, and I am presenting my project on the collective reincorporation of ex-combatants in Colombia. So the starting point for this project was thinking about international standards for ex-combatant reintegration, and the word used in these standards is reintegration, that favor more individualized approaches with the aim of breaking the social ties of non-state armed groups that collectively demobilize. And this is based in part on the logic of security, a very narrow view of ex-combatants as threats to security. And so the idea is to take away their collective capacity to make war, but without consideration for how they might use that collective capacity to make peace. And then also it's informed by liberal peace ideas about individual rights and individual benefits. And so what tends to happen with individualized reintegration is that there's an individualized plan with supplementary income, maybe education, job training. It varies from one context to another. And also an emphasis on returning to your pre-conflict family or your community. This approach has some limitations. Above all, it's associated with overall poor outcomes for ex-combatants, especially in terms of creating problems with social isolation and also disempowerment. And so just to give you a sense of that, I have a quote here from a FARC ex-combatant that I spoke to that sort of captures this disillusionment and idea that they're just being reintegrated back into the ranks of the poor through the peace process. And so, given that context, against that backdrop, Colombia took a different approach in 2016 in their peace agreement with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, which was an armed group for 60 years in Colombia. And that agreement actually included what I consider very modest support for collective reintegration, things that actually weren't particularly novel, like economic cooperatives, support for a political party. You find those things in many contemporary peace agreements. What was innovative in Colombia is that as the peace process unfolded, as it was implemented, some of the disarmament camps that they created actually began to evolve into more permanent ex-combatant communities. And so you had this social component where you had former combatants living together in collective communities tied to territories supported by cooperatives, and that was really different. And so what I want to do then with this project is evaluate what impact did that have on the ex-combatants, on their commitment to peace, and what was sort of the implications of this for the peace process there. And so my research is really guided by two questions. The first one is, why did some of these spaces turn into sustainable communities where others did not? A lot of them fragmented or were abandoned over time. And then secondarily, and I think most importantly, what was the impact of all of this on the peace process in Colombia so far? And so I think that these questions are important and that they can contribute both theoretically but also practically. In terms of academic contributions, there is a kind of accepted wisdom that informs international standards, mostly coming from political science and peace studies, that says that ex-combatant unity is a threat to post-conflict stability, again, based on this very narrow view of ex-combatants and sort of that all ex-combatants are the same, they're threats to security, they need to be disempowered. But then also sort of building on other work that's, I think, less prominent, but really important from sociologists and anthropologists who do find that in some contexts, ex-combatants, and particularly when they remain in social networks, they can be stakeholders and agents of peace when they are empowered, and we can talk in the Q&A about specific examples of that. And so from a policy perspective, I also hope that the work can sort of speak to peace practitioners and provide useful information for future iterations of international standards for reintegration. And so what I did to answer these questions in Colombia, I did several rounds of intensive field research. The analysis is qualitative. It's based mainly on semi-structured interviews with right now 59 FARC ex-combatants across 9 departments and 6 collective spaces. And I went to these spaces and I stayed usually for a few weeks, depending on where it was. And I did most of my interviews there. And of course, I supplemented that with all sorts of data and sort of reports from government, from the United Nations, and from the NGOs and local community organizations. And so what I found was that there was this tremendous variation, which was really interesting. So that's the first thing that I found, and I tried to capture that here with these 2 pictures. So on the one hand, you had these sustainable spaces, which I define systematically as spaces that are more cohesive. They maintained a large percentage of their ex-combatant population, joined by other family members, and then families grew. There was a baby boom after the peace agreement, including in these spaces. So there's a lot of young people, a lot of children there. And not only were they cohesive, but they were well organized. They formed these government action boards, which are really important in rural Colombia, with elected members of their community to organize them. They had cooperatives with multiple projects underneath of them. They had political councils, they had gender committees, all sorts of organizations through which, right, they were empowered, and empowerment emerged as something really important in my work. And then on the other hand, right, so on the right here is a space in Agua Bonita de Caquetá in southern Colombia, and that was a more sustainable space. On the left, this is a territorial space in southern Tolima and sort of southwest central Colombia, which actually wasn't abandoned. It's kind of an intermediate case, but you can just visually see the difference here. And so more folks left from that space. They struggled to organize because very few people were there. And so it had a very different impact on the ex-combatants and sort of their, I don't want to say commitment to peace, they certainly were not abandoning the process, but the folks in Planadas were certainly much more disillusioned than the folks in the Caqueta case. And so to understand this, I talked to lots of people. There are many, many factors. I don't want to be super deterministic here that contribute to why these spaces sustain and they don't, and a lot of them are at the individual level. But two factors really stood out as things we can think about in terms of our design of reincorporation programs in the future. And one was the geography of disarmament. There was a wave of ex-combatants that left these spaces as soon as they were able to, as soon as they were sort of cleared by the UN. And in some cases, they left as individuals. They had something to return to, and they did. But in many cases, they left as units because they had disarmed in areas where they didn't fight and where they weren't from. And so they wanted to return and be closer to their communities and have their political projects there. So they didn't really abandon the collective, but they did abandon the territorial spaces and form smaller collectives elsewhere. And then later on, there was another wave of abandonment from these zones. And this, I think, was driven more by security concerns. So in particular, in those areas of Colombia that were still hot, and by that I mean conflict zones, you had reemerging security threats, which had a lot to do with the FARC disarming and creating a vacuum of power. And when that happened, other armed groups arrived to the area and sort of tried to assert their authority. And these territorial spaces, as you can imagine, became targets of violence, sometimes through forced recruitment. And that caused a lot of the population there to have to displace. Or in some cases, they did form part of the splinter groups that now exist. But most of them displaced. I think the rearmament for FARC is quite low compared to previous Colombian processes at like 10 to 15%. So they just moved to cities like Bogotá and like Cali, where actually I interviewed quite a few of them. And so you have these two different kinds of spaces, but it's actually more of a continuum. And it's in those areas of Colombia where you did have something closer to a post-conflict context, and where the group that disarmed was sort of from the area, that you get these more sustainable outcomes. And so that teaches us something about where collective reintegration or reincorporation is sustainable, is viable as a way forward, and where it might not be, or where it might pose certain risks, not just for peace, but also for the ex-combatants themselves. Over 300 FARC ex-combatants have been assassinated since the peace agreement. Okay, so I think like the sort of, so why does it matter? Who cares if, right, ex-combatant communities are sustainable or not? I care, but like, why should everyone else care? And I think it's because where these spaces sustained, they had positive effects on peace. And this for me happened through two mechanisms at two levels. And the first was really just the ex-combatants themselves. Interestingly, even though they expressed a lot of disillusionment and even concern because their material conditions were very poor, they still expressed a sense of that they had maintained a lot of their empowerment and their capacity to continue to pursue their political goals, to continue to resist in a nonviolent way. And that seems to really tie them to the peace agreement and to continued commitment to peace. And I think that that's really important. And then at the group level as well, and these collectives, they maintain this capacity to continue to bargain with external stakeholders on behalf of their own interests initially, and then maybe over time, towards their bigger goals. So they would approach the United Nations, they would approach the local government, that they would approach non-government organizations, and those stakeholders would come to them. And so they were able to advocate, the continuation of some benefits and support, help with expanding their infrastructure, continued funding for their projects. And I think that capacity is lost when they get individualized. And so I think that's important as well. What tends to happen is they lay down arms and all of their collective capacity goes away. And so I think it was empowering in that role, that way as well. And just to sort of give you a sense of that, Here's some pictures that I took in different camps that I went to. Well, they're not camps, they're communities now. So in the top left corner, this is sort of the construction of belonging and identity that happens at the individual level, which I think is empowering, especially for ex-combatants that can't go home. And this is something that's generally not considered in international standards. This is like, there's this idea that it's good for them to return to families or community. And sometimes it's people join armed groups because they face abuse or violence in their homes. And there's a lot of ex-combatants who are estranged in this way, and they find the social support they need by staying in these collectives. And so they sort of fill that void for some ex-combatants, though not all were in that position. And so you can see that here, right, in the top left, this is in Pandores in La Guajira, which is in the northeast of Colombia, and it says, in this house, we all fit. And then in the left corner, we are the diversity of Monte, like the countryside, if you will, and that's in southern Colombia. And then you can see as well, they continue to maintain their identity, their political identity, their history, they celebrate it in these spaces, and that is not a past that they want to let go of. They want to be committed to peace, but still have this identity, which is really important to them in this sense of belonging. And so I think most importantly, what I find in these spaces is that these identities are being transformed by and very strongly tied to a commitment to peace. And the murals everywhere really speak to that, but so do the interviews themselves. And so, they remain as a collective strongly committed to pursuing their goals in peacetime, and they feel somewhat empowered to do so because they are together and working as a unit. And this happens despite the fact that I should mention at the national level, the FARC party did not do well. It has fragmented as a national project. So this is a more of a local level empowerment that I'm seeing, but I think nonetheless it's important. And so on the other hand, and I have just a little bit of time, there's also this capacity, this component when it comes to bargaining with external stakeholders. So here's some examples of the UN. There was also the Colombian Truth Commission was visiting when I was there. They're forming all sorts of organizations to pursue all sorts of causes that they care about. And so this just gives you a sense of that. This was International Women's Day in Caquetá in 2019, and the entire community and all sorts of organizations came and they had a huge celebration. And so to conclude, and I did pretty well on time. So I think if there's some sort of big takeaways here, the projects that shows that government-supported collective reincorporation, it can be a tool for peace building, but it is strongly conditioned on other factors, in particular, a government will to implement security guarantees, and establishing collectives in areas where the units were active, because they still want their political projects to be there. And importantly, when it comes to the FARC, they're very clear on this. We disarmed, but we did not demobilize. So those who remain in the collectives, they want to resist and they want to do it through nonviolent methods, but those spaces need to be maintained in order for that to happen. And then finally, I think that most reintegration approaches problematically center on disempowerment, and this is explicit, not accidental, because they want to weaken the fighters, obviously, their capacity to make war, but I do think that that capacity can be harnessed for peace, though it has to be done carefully. And empowerment needs to be nurtured and considered in international standards for reintegration.
Passing the computer down.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in Trinidad and Tobago, and also to have a chance to learn about all your work. And first of all, thanks as well to Linda and to IPRAF for supporting my work and I guess all of our work. In my case, certainly, it would have been very difficult to kind of bring it to a successful conclusion. This presentation and my PhD work in general is on the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and I will refer to it as the IPRA, which is, well, it's slightly over 100 years old now, 100-year-old, let's say, peace entity, organization, founded in the heat of World War One. So in this presentation, I'll just talk a little bit about the history of IPRA and some of the literature, the theoretical framework I'm using in my PhD thesis, the methodology and resources, some of my findings and some conclusions. So the basics about IPRA. Oh, it's not moving through. Some of the basics on IPRA. So it was founded in Bilthoven, which is a suburb of Utrecht in the Netherlands, in 1919. It was founded as a movement towards a Christian international by Protestant but ecumenically minded Christian pacifists. It changed its name to the International Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1923. The photo on the top right there was taken at that first gathering. And it was a response, obviously, to the kind of the destruction and reflections that were happening in Christian circles in the aftermath of World War One. Nevertheless, the first branches of the International had come together in the first years of the war. So it was founded in the UK in 1914 and in the USA soon after in 1915. The chap on the bottom left, Henry Hodgkin, was an instrumental figure in founding both of those branches. Friedrich Siegmund Schulze, the other chap, was chaplain to the Kaiser in Germany, and the two of them had a moving moment in Cologne, which is kind of said to be kind of the spiritual founding, if you like, of IPRA. Today, IPRA continues to exist. There's somewhere around 40 branches and affiliates around the world on all continents. I served on the board of IPRA between 1917 and 2022. So 105 years I served. Not bad going. Anyway, moving on. So to a certain extent, those responsibilities have perhaps impacted on the speed at which I've been sort of finishing up my PhD at the same time. I stood down last year in November largely to sort of clear the way to do the write-up. I won't dwell too much on this, but you can compare that founding statement there, which on the left has been described by Cale as a mature statement of Christian pacifism. It's still used by the British branch or the English and Scottish branch. Today, as a whole, the IPRA is more sort of interreligiously minded rather than just Christian, and the current statement of purpose describes that. In terms of the literature available, well, there's very little, which is kind of the basic justification for being able to do a thesis on IPRA. The two texts on the right there, two photographs display the only two actual studies that exist about IPRA. Neither have been done, neither are academic pieces of work. One was written in 1941 by an early member, just surveying the situation at the time, and Vera Britton, who was a British pacifist, wrote a more systematic account in 1964, but we're still talking well over half a century ago. So there's basically been nothing on the IPRA as a whole since then, although there have been a couple of important studies on the historical British and American branches and on some of the important figures within IPRA, including Muriel Lester, who I spoke of here the other day, Nevin Sayer, and Hildegard and John Watts-Meyer. So their work helps to fill in, those works help to fill in some of the gaps, but there's still plenty of room for an academic approach. And as I'm based in Granada, my thesis will be in Spanish, and I'm assured by my supervisor who knows of these things that there's absolutely nothing in Spanish. So it's a contribution in that sense too. What I think I'm finding is that IPRA is an entity that has validated the pacifist option in the spheres of the church, state, and society. So my first chapter is sort of bringing the history up to date, including using some of the archival material, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there's still plenty of gaps, including obviously most of the second half century of the organisation, particularly its work in the Global South. The theoretical framework, I spoke a little on this in my presentation the other day. I won't go into too much depth because of time, but I've been drawn to the idea of civilian or citizen diplomacy as contrasted with conventional state-to-state diplomacy. And so, in a sense, the highlighting the character of IPRA as an actor in the new diplomacies. This obviously is another gap that the literature hasn't really picked up on. Lopez Martinez is my supervisor, Mario. He says that sort of other aspects of IPRA work are more interesting and influential. I beg to differ with him slightly. I argue that you can't understand IPRA without this dimension, and indeed it has proved influential. So much of the thesis will be case studies to demonstrate this in the same fields of church, state, and society, and the effect of this kind of, in terms of contribution to knowledge, will be to broaden the scope of understanding of civilian diplomacy. So the idea of civil society as an actor in diplomacy has sort of been around for about 50 odd years now, perhaps more intensively since Montville coined the term track 2 diplomacy in the 1990s. But a couple of the more pioneering studies came out in the 70s. Nevertheless, none of them take any of their examples or take examples of any sort of activity prior to World War II. So I think there's an opportunity here to expand the scope. One definition among many that I've come across is quoted in a recent article which describes as a non-state actor in the new diplomacies. Units within the international system, whether entities, groups, or individuals, that have the ability to mobilize resources, allowing them to achieve their objectives, and that have the capacity to exercise influence over other actors in the system, and who enjoy a certain autonomy. So the idea of objectives, influence, and autonomy, I find quite helpful in thinking this through. Coming now to the methodology and resources that I've employed, and this is where kind of IPRAF comes in. My pitch to IPRAF was basically to undertake my archival research. I planned to visit the Central Evangelical Archive in Berlin, which by arrangement hosts the IPRA files, and also the Swarthmore College Peace Collection over in Philadelphia. Now, I was due to be undertaking this in 2020, and we all know what happened in March of that year. So I was fortunate, really, to be able to go to Berlin. I never did reach Swarthmore. But I like to quote Lederach and his writing from the Moral Imagination that he speaks of serendipity and sort of going with the flow of unexpected circumstances. And I find that's quite relevant in this case, because it happened that I was able to make the most of those circumstances. I'd come across, or I was coming across almost in real time, other resources at the World Council of Churches archive in Geneva, at the IPRA offices, or the Austrian branch of the IPRA in Vienna, and the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. So IPRAF were very generous in how they kind of allowed me to reformulate the project as I went along, basically. So I visited all those archives in 2020 and returned to Geneva and Amsterdam in 2021. Swarthmore at the same time offered a scanning service, which I availed of and found them to be very generous and helpful. En route, I was able to undertake 10 or 11 interviews in person or on Zoom, depending on how they preferred at the time, given the public health situation, with ex-IPRA presidents or secretary generals. So I've got a good amount of literature, and some of the findings, the case studies that I referred to in terms of how we can bring civilian diplomacy to bear or through the IPRA in this field. In terms of the state, there are two examples that I'm focusing on, perhaps a little more conventional in the sense that they take as their object of diplomacy the state or multilateral institutions. So a project they initiated in the run to World War II called the Embassies of Reconciliation, which was an attempt by the IPRA to try and, they visited a number of European leaders to try and basically bring a halt to the ever more inexorable dynamics towards World War II. Obviously, they failed at that, but it was an attempt that probably quite bold attempt at that time. And also, IPRA was one of the first NGOs to acquire ECOSOC status at the UN. So that's one area. The Embassies of Reconciliation reports are found at the IISH in Amsterdam. In terms of how IPRA has taken civilian diplomacy into the realm of society, they were the first, I think I'm right in saying this, they were the first to come up with the idea of the Alternative Summit at Stockholm in 1972, when the UN held its first sort of environmental focused summit on the human environment. So they played a role in shifting the focus there onto civil society. And another case I'm taking from the Vienna archives is John and Hildegard's work on their sort of cross Iron Curtain focus, intensive focus, people-to-people work between East and West Europe. And then in the church, together with the historical peace churches, IPRA, and this material is in Geneva, has been influential on the World Council of Churches position on pacifism. The World Council of Churches is a sort of Protestant Orthodox ecumenical meeting space. And at the same time, the Gosmeyers had an almost single-handed attempt at Vatican II to introduce the same thinking into the Catholic Church. I think I'm going to coin this theological civilian diplomacy. We can see one of the impacts of this some decades down the line, but in the way that Pope Francis, in his Fratelli Tutti encyclical 2 or 3 years ago, wrote about the just war position being almost obsolete. So sort of perhaps many years later, we're seeing the fruits of these labours. A couple of other findings, just very briefly, because I'm now short of time, but I've come to the idea of conceptualizing IPRA as a network, using thinking from social network analysis, the vocabulary of nodes, ties, and boundaries. I've just put in a very basic graph, sort of visual aid there as to how this is commonly visualized. That's something I'm not going to be able to explore in great depth in my thesis, but I think it's something for the possible postdoc research. And also, I would argue that the discovery of these archives is a finding in itself. No one really has had the chance to explore these archives. Even the principal one at Berlin, they were sort of quite surprised to have someone show up and go through the archives. So even says something, that's the principal one. So in terms of conclusions, this is an overdue study of a little known but influential entity. Little known because it's largely worked behind the scenes, including in its civilian diplomacy, which I argue is a core feature of its work. The research has brought to light new primary sources, and it should be of interest for further research to peace historians and those researching the new diplomacies, social network analysis, and ecumenism, church history. Many thanks.
begin by echoing Peter and thanking the IPRA Foundation for supporting the fieldwork part of my PhD research. And today I'm going to talk about a specific part of the PhD, which is about the Saturday Mothers Movement. And I'm going to try to elaborate more on their contributions to transitional justice in Turkey. So my broader research, the PhD, was built on two main pillars. The first one was about the implications of using the transitional justice framework during an ongoing conflict, because traditionally transitional justice has been used after the conflict has ended or after an authoritarian regime collapsed and a democratic regime was built. But in Turkey, in the current situation, we have an armed conflict going on and we have an authoritarian. So I was looking into that, but the other part of the research was focusing more on the role of organized victims and how they pursue the goals of transitional justice and how they advance these goals in a non-transitional setting like Turkey. And to do that, I focused specifically on the Saturday Mothers Movement, and this is mainly because they are the longest lasting social movement and they are the most systematically organized victim group as well. So this was a qualitative case study, and I conducted my fieldwork in two phases. And like Peter's, my fieldwork was also disrupted by pandemic. So I had to redesign some of the fieldwork that I planned. And in total, I conducted 24 interviews, both in person and online, with civil society actors, with activists from this movement, but also with practitioners who work with victims. So just a brief background to the Kurdish conflict. The armed conflict itself started in 1984 and is still going on between the Kurdish armed group PKK and Turkish security forces, but the root causes of the conflict go back to the beginning of the Turkish Republic. Because the Republic in 1923 was founded as a nation state to create a homogeneous Turkish nation, and as a result of this policy, it was needed a strong Turkification of all peoples, which included the assimilation of Kurds and elimination of a distinctive Kurdish identity, because Kurds were the largest non-Turkish ethnic group in Turkey, so they were targeted very violently and strongly by the state. And during the armed conflict in the 1990s, we witnessed the peak of state violence, especially in the Kurdish region. And enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings were widespread. But the 1990s were also the period where we had a mass political mobilization of Kurds, including the victims of state violence. And the Saturday Mothers Movement, which I'm going to talk more about, emerged in this context as a response to enforced disappearances, and they began getting together in 1995. Their first gathering was on the 27th of May, so in 1 week, I think it will be their 28th anniversary, so it's been quite a long time since they started coming together. There was a 10-year break at some point, but they started their gatherings again in 2009, and they continued even with a bigger group after that point. They got together as human rights activists and relatives of the disappeared, so it wasn't just the families of the disappeared people, but a lot of human rights activists, and the majority of them were feminist activists and human rights defenders, as they identify themselves. They got together and they wanted to do something about the state's policy of enforced disappearances. And they started their demonstrations in the Galatasaray Square, which is in the very center of Istanbul. So it was a very carefully chosen location because it was very centrally located, it was very touristic as well, so they could gather attention from lots of different groups of audience. So they started commemorating those who disappeared, but also asked for truth, justice, and accountability for the enforced disappearances. And they were, since then, they've been organizing silent sit-ins every Saturday. So this is just a very reduced chronology of what's been going on lately in Turkey. So the current government, they have been in power since 2002. So it's been 21 years. years already, and as you probably know, we had presidential and parliamentary elections just last Sunday, and there was a big hope that their rule would end. It didn't. Now we have another round of elections. So there's still some hope, but not as strong as before. But especially during the last decade, there were several important developments in terms of the Kurdish conflict. Between 2013 and 15, we had a peace process, but then the peace process collapsed and violence escalated again. And this time it was more in the Kurdish urban regions instead of the rural areas. So in Kurdish towns, villages, and cities, there was a massive destruction of buildings, but also killings of civilians. So it was a very violent period following 2015. And then we had a failed military coup attempt in 2016, and that failed attempt gave the government a perfect excuse to implement a crackdown on human rights, basically. So we were under a state of emergency for 2 years, and a lot of NGOs were shut down, many people went to jail or they had to leave the country, so it was a very repressive period. It still is, and we also changed there was a regime change in the meantime as well. So now we have the Turkish Turkish-style presidential system. This is the context we are in now. And another brief background, this time to the transitional justice efforts in Turkey. We never had an official or overarching transitional justice framework, but especially between 2005 and 15, demands for truth, justice, and memorialization gained popularity among civil society actors. And the government's response changed from time to time, but there were times that they were kind of supportive, at least not very expressly against these efforts, but they were never fully supportive. During this period, grassroots actors mobilized to create spaces of truth recovery and also to overcome the long-lived impunity for state violence. And there were some official responses, as I mentioned, but it was understood later that they were very pragmatic responses, and the government would change their position quite rapidly if the situation was not in their interest. So I was trying to understand how organized victims can mobilize the goals of transitional justice and build a sustainable movement, especially when the political context is really not in their favor and when there's not an official transitional justice agenda or framework. And I found out a couple of important elements that contributed to that. And the first one is the format of their gatherings in terms of specifically about the Saturday Mothers movement. So they decided to hold silent sit-ins and using non-violence and also using photos of the disappeared. So instead of using banners or any other type of symbols that would be associated with some political movements, for example, they would only hold the pictures of the disappeared people, and they would get together at noon every Saturday on the same square. And they start with telling the stories about the disappeared people, and then they also tell about the justice process or the non-existing justice process or their own pursuit for justice. So what happened after the act of disappearance, and every week is dedicated to one or two people who were disappeared, so their families and their lawyers would give an account of what happened, basically. And another important strategy that they used, and this was mentioned a lot in my interviews, that they try to stay independent from political organizations. This doesn't mean that they are not giving political messages. They are very much politicized. They would talk about their broader political goals as well. So it's not that they are only focusing on the disappeared, but they didn't want to be associated or instrumentalized for other political parties' goals, and they made a really strong effort to make sure that it's happening. For me, one of the most important strategies that I found, and I was also surprised to find that it was the use of the image of mothers as ideal or innocent victims. To me, it's really interesting because now we use both Saturday mothers and Saturday people to refer to this movement, or we use them together, just like here, Saturday mothers / Saturday people. Many people would refer to them as such, and I was wondering, my guess was that they probably started as Saturday mothers and maybe over time they evolved into Saturday people, but I didn't know, and I wanted to understand. And I asked my participants, who are still part of the movement, but they are from the younger generation, so I didn't interview any of the mothers. They were more either siblings or daughters or sons of the disappearing people. And the reason they gave for these two different names is that the movement started as mothers, but then because there are a lot of people now supporting the movement, like lawyers, people from political parties, or just human rights activists, they would go to the square to support these people. Now they use Saturday people to be more inclusive, but the mothers are still very much at the center or at the essence of this movement, and it should be maintained as such. But interestingly, this is not what happened. So in the beginning, because there was a lot of feminist activists and women human rights activists when they first got together, it didn't start as a movement of families or mothers. It was a broad network of different people who cared about disappearances and who wanted to take a stance. And when I went back to the news articles that were written by feminist activists at the time, they make it clear that they really wanted to identify and be referred as Saturday people. They were against the use of Saturday mothers, but they weren't successful because the media kept referring to them as mothers, although they would sign their press statements as Saturday people and they would insist on that, but it didn't happen. One of the reasons was probably because similarities between Saturday people and Plaza de Mayo mothers, for example, so there were those international links. So it was easier for people to make those connections. But also it brought a lot of legitimacy and credibility and support to the movement itself. So building your movement around this identity of mothers, it made it more justified or legitimate because it was easier to relate to mothers suffering and mothers who lost her daughter or son. And this is how the current activists talk about it as well. But I thought it was really interesting that they don't even know about how it came about, and they just assume that it was the mothers, because it started as mothers, which is not true. It didn't start as mothers movement, but now there's that strong component. Okay. I have a quote here from one of the activists who are. She's still involved, and she is her her brother, who was a Kurdish journalist, was killed in the 1990s, and her parents have been involved in the Saturday Mothers movement for quite a long time, and now she also goes there every week, and she's sometimes arrested as well. So I asked her about this naming too, and another interesting thing is they told me that they never had a discussion about it, so it's not a constant or deliberate choice to be referred to as Saturday mothers or people in recent years at least, but they all assume a sort of explanation. So what she said is, this is a really beautiful support, but because this is a type of demonstration that mothers initiated, that mothers look for their own children or husbands, I think as a discourse, Saturday mothers is a more appropriate discourse. Because when you say Saturday people, it loses that thing. I mean, the essence of the matter gets enlarged a little bit more, and it is as if that first connotation gets lost. So they really think the mothers, the emphasis on mothers should stay as it is because it keeps the movement going. And it is probably true, it's a very strong image, but there are also so many other actors who are involved. And I also think it can be a bit problematic if we ever get to a point where we have an official transitional justice process and people will need to maybe register as victims or identify as victims, and holding on to this ideal or innocent victims could be then creating hierarchies between different types of victims, because there are so many other victims and organized victims as well. We are not there yet, so it's not a real problem, but it might. So that's why I thought it was important. I wanted to show this as also to give you an idea about how mothers are at the very center. So this woman, it's the same woman on the two photos. She was one of the most symbolic figures of the movement. She's not alive anymore, but she has been there from the very beginning, and her face is very much associated with the movement. So it is true that mothers play an important role, and as you can see in this photo, mothers are always sitting in front, so they are the ones who are at the very forefront of the movement, also visibly. And they are the ones who make decisions, so there are all these other things as well that the broader movement try to support them and try to make sure that they're at the center. And in this banner, that this is what they use all the time, it says, we know the perpetrators, where are the surveillance? This is from their week 600, which was a few years ago already. It's not always as crowded, but in like some important days, it gets really packed like this one, and they are supported by so many different groups of people, not only activists or political figures. I think I have to just rush through these last slides. So in this part, I was just trying to expand more on how they contributed to the goals or pillars of transitional justice. And here I approach those pillars as truth, justice, memorialization processes, and guarantees of non-recurrence. But yeah, I don't think I have time to go over slides. Okay, I'll just leave it here and I can talk more about them in the Q&A.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I am Rajit Malsia. I am Assistant Professor of Conflict, Peace and Development Studies at Cambridge University. So, I acknowledge the principal grant support from IPRA Foundation for this work. This morning, I talked about some of the outputs of this research, but now I am not focusing on the outputs or findings. I am just focusing on one piece, that is why and how we are doing this. I am just focusing on that part of the portion class. So realizing that what is necessary for the prevalence of conflict at this level, one must go beyond the surface of conditioned thinking to explore the foundation of the conflict created. So as part of peace education, so when I started working on this, I thought I started from very big philosophy and very high expectation. But when I started working on many villages, these are the instances what I encountered. In a village, recently we found there are 402 children of 5 to 16 years age group. They are school going age group. Only 2 children can recognize letters. So other 400 children even can't recognize alphabets and numbers. Similarly, last year we conducted one assessment in one whole province, and in that province, in grade 8, in rural area, only 42 students out of 100 can read grade 2 level stories or grade 2 level basic arithmetic. So even if we mixed all urban and rural setup, it won't go more than 50%. So even if they are in school for more than 9 years, they are going to school every day. It's already 9 years. They are in grade 8 or grade 9, but they can't read simple story from grade 1 or grade 2. The data might differ in different countries. And one part of big network that's working now on this initiative we call People's Action for Learning. Now we saw data from 15 countries doing similar kind of work. And it ranges from different regions, from 20 to 80%. But it is evident that in almost all global south countries, many children, they are in school, but they are not able to read or just do basic arithmetic. So my question is straight in my head. We can imagine the world in 2040, 2035, or 2050. If we have 40% population at that time can't read simple letters, appointment letters, or they can't calculate their salaries, or they can't go to market and calculate how to buy stuffs. What kind of peace we achieve? There can be easily, unless we have societies with this situation, there can be easily a lot of terrorist group or other people can brainwash people because they can't read themselves what's happening. They have to rely on other people, leaders of speech, what's going on there. So this is a very deep-rooted structural violence I see in many countries, from Nepal, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Kenya, Tanzania. Many countries we have done this. We have found that. So across the world, large proportion of children are not acquiring foundational reading and numeracy skills even after spending several years in school. That's evident in many reports by UNESCO. Every year they are reading that fact. And World Bank has started using the word learning poverty. Many times when we use the word poverty, we just use the like an image of money or finances. What about the learning capabilities? That's why I think huge crisis in this time. So I have seen in many rural areas there's a vicious trap of this financial poverty and learning poverty. They are financially poor, so they can't afford the better education access. So those children are grappling with this learning poverty. Because they are under this learning poverty, next generation also will go to the same financial poverty because they can't go to better opportunities or better jobs. So this is a kind of vicious trap, how it is fueling conflict or violence in many parts of the areas. So we started our participatory action research, the model. So here we try to deal with this learning poverty. So using citizen-led actions model. So here what we did, so at first, we hired a lot of young people from grade 11, 12. They are 17, 18 years old. We try to find them from high school who are performing well. We train them how they can do assessments, how they can identify, how they can diagnose this problem. And then they are trained how they can discuss about these issues with the local people in their own community. They share the evidence to local stakeholders, identifying those strategies to work. And then they will sit together and they decide themselves how they want to tackle that issue. Either they work with the school, or they also, in some places, schools are resisting too much. They don't want to deal with this. They say, we have to cover the curriculum. They want to cover the same, like the curriculum for a year, like children are going to schools, but still in grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, they are teaching grade 6 level stories, 7 level textbooks, but the children, we found half of them, even they are not in grade 2 level. And many school teachers, they resist. They don't want to deal with this problem. Now, in many villages, the local youths and community members have established village learning centers. So they are trying to deal with those issues. And I have seen in almost 120 days or 240 hours, if we teach very systematically, many children can be upgraded from beginner, nothing to do, grade 2 level story reading level. We have done that, we have seen that it's possible. And we see this whole model called citizen assessment. So there are basic 4 fundamental principles what our research is partially developed. We use oral assessment. Because many times in grade 1 and grade 2 in our schools, they start focusing on writing. If the language proficiency, we all know that reading is very important than before starting writing. But in our schools, even I have seen that when they go to preschool, they give pen and paper at the beginning. They start asking writing alphabets. So there's another big problem because the most difficult task is given to the children the first day of the school. And another problem, our schools are taking assessments, examination to rank children. Even in the grade 1, imagine there are 40 children, they don't know about what does it mean being first, second, third. Our school system take examination and rank them. You are first, you are second, you are third. So when we put them in the competitive environment, see, I have seen a lot of job opportunities. They say we encourage teamwork, collaboration. When we expect people to work in team, but we start our life competitions from very beginning. We put in that environment, but we expect the teamwork, peace, collaboration, that part. So I have seen these competitions, this assessment, this ranking process in schools are seeds of conflict, how they are injecting the individual like merit and the competitiveness among the children. That's why we are trying to shift the whole idea of this marking and ranking. So we are trying to develop like kind of oral assessment without written. It's more oral, it's conducted one-on-one. So we don't let publicly like what's the like situation of the children there. And it is conducted in the household level. We are not doing it in school. We are doing the household because SDG goal, even 4.1.1, that expects all children to learn. But now I have seen most of the school achievement tests happening in the schools means they are only assessing children those who are in schools. In many parts of the world, in rural areas, that there are only 60, 70 or 80% children are in school. But this assessment is all reporting are hiding 30% children's level in all this big data. So that we want to have the model that we don't do assessment in schools. We have to do assessment in household level to check the lifelong skills. If we don't care about the curriculum's targets, we have to at least set some priorities, what are the minimum proficiency, so that these young people, our next generation can thrive in their life. At least we believe that they should be able to read this exit sign to find out where the door is, or just identify the seat numbers, even if they are going as migrant workers to work in Gulf countries, from Nepal, from Bangladesh. Or they should be able to calculate their salaries if they are getting salaries in Korea or Qatar or Malaysia. That's the minimum proficiency for me. So that's the grade 2 level like task. That's why we have developed our assessment format in grade 2 level, like stories, sentences in that model. We go to house, our young people go house to house and they assess kids one-on-one basis, orally, and just like they prepare the report, simple report. And just, so I have found like some examples. So these are the ways how they are being assessed in houses. So I would like to show you the pattern of the questions. These are Nepali testing tool questions. You can see like the patterns, is letter level questions first. So even those children who can't recognize letters, we categorize them as beginners. So they need support in understanding alphabets. And those children who can recognize letters, we test them with the word. If they can read word, then we take them towards the sentence level. If they can read sentences, then we take them towards the story level. So this is how the progression based, like even in math, we have 1-digit number, 2-digit number, simple addition without carryover, then addition with carryover, subtraction without carryover, subtraction with carryover, and division 2-digit by 1-digit without remainder, with remainder. And then we have the problem, the word problem. So we believe that this is a minimum proficiency. If they can do this, they will have lifelong skills, like they can use this in their life, so they can, at least even if they go as a unskilled labor in Gulf countries, at least they can know what salary they are getting, or they can read certain like documents, what they are supposed to read. So that English questions also. So if you see like how we have progression, I already told that we try to see children, they require a different level of support. Like they are in beginner level, they need support in understanding alphabets. There are children, they need support in letter level understanding. Or there are children, they already know letter, now they need support in word level understanding. So sentence level understanding, story level understanding. And if they can read a story, then we take them towards a bit higher level, that fact retrieval questions. We ask them questions to retrieve some facts from the stories. If they can do that, then they will go to a bit of that. They can influential like some reasons, how, why, more critical reasoning. So if they can do that, then we take them to a higher level. Like this morning, I was talking about how we are creating spaces where people can come together, talk about social issues, how they can, what problem they have, and how they can solve the problem. So we have different kinds of activities we have developed in this part of process. So all these are led by mothers, young volunteers, and local people. It's not like outsiders coming. We can see all these learning centers created by locals in their local communities. We are not spending single rupees from outside to create all these learning centers. It's just like ideas we are giving. Local people themselves identify location. Themselves they identify. In one place, I saw they have venue, but they don't have any carpets like this to sit. So they are arranging all these sacks of rice, they buy in the house to cook food. Now those rice sacks are being used as a seat for the children. All children carry those sacks every day, coming in the learning center and learning and going back. So this is I think the young people, because they are the being agent of social change, and they are running. In some places we don't have even learning centers, like we don't have houses. They are doing open field. So they are running learning centers there also through all play-based methods. So here, what I want to argue, like in last 20 years, I have seen in Nepal also, the government has increased, even IITs have increased a lot of money on inputs, like bags, books, benches, buildings, uniforms, lots of investment. Even there are a lot of efforts to bring children into schools. We have seen increase, like I really thank for that. Now, in 2000, it was 61% children going to school. Now we have 97% children going to school. But question is, does these inputs or even sending children to school equate to learning? We have observed in the last 7 years, we have already worked in more than 271 villages in Nepal. And our villages show that more than 60% children, even they have been to school for more than 8 years, they are not even learning grade 1 level tests or grade 2 level studies. So going to school is not equal to learning. And that's a big question for our time now. So our teaching methods, they are a big colonial project still. They are like kind of industrial assembly line style. They expect our children to be in classroom like this, 10 to 5, even they are not into that like style, you know. We expect them to be obedient, disciplined. Our project is not to make them learn. Our project is make them obedient. Make them like more soldiers, because Nepal is exporting soldiers last 200 years. In British Army, British Gurkha, everybody knows. Now we are sending security guards in Qatar, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So we are just creating people to be obedient, follow orders. We are creating that first World War, second World War, how we created all these soldiers by this education system. I think the way we are performing in classroom, the pedagogy, we are not investing in pedagogy still now. We are spending a lot of money on creating desk bench classrooms, even for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years old child. So this is the, I think, structural violence we are creating through pedagogy in schools. So that is where we need to be serious. It doesn't mean teaching pace. So we are talking about teaching for peace. For peace means we have to create that collaborative learning spaces that can happen even without classroom. That can happen outside of classroom. So that's why we brought ideas of using arts or some techniques where children can learn by playing, and we are trying to use all local people. So just I'm just trying to summarize some of our just give some points. With using arts and artistic practices excite the imagination. I have seen that from our research, and allow learners to put themselves in any situation of their choosing. Like sometimes, if we can't take them to the Egypt, we can create some imaginary situation inside the classroom like through role plays. So even without resources, without investing money, we can create a lot of learning environment, exciting environment inside classroom. But many teachers are not doing that, so that our children are only focusing this main problem. Second one, these young volunteers from local villages facilitated activities allow for cost-effective and rapid scaling through the education system. But can this methodology be trusted to maintain quality delivery? Many people in Kathmandu also raise question about the quality. But we have seen that high quality, highly trained from university teachers, they are teaching children for 8 years, 9 years, even they are not able to read alphabets. Means it is not about the quality of teachers, it's about the pedagogy, how we are creating learning spaces. And also, we are creating a lot of burden on the teachers so that they should know everything. And always they have to impart knowledge. There is no culture of this participative learning processes. It's more power over. And that's why, in my this conclusion, in this process, I found locals are feeling more ownership. They have seen many times outsiders or experts come in their villages, do field work, and they go away. They did not even know whether and how they use the data. But here, in this process, the local youths are skilled. They are hired, they are trained how to work, do assessment, how to teach, how to facilitate. They also get skills. They do assessment themselves. They prepare report in local languages. Even the less educated local leaders can understand. Simply like saying you have 100 children in grade 8, out of them 20 can't even recognize letters. That's even any people can understand this. It doesn't require very sophisticated statistical analysis. And based on that, they develop some evidence-based policy. So we train young people to use art-based method, some play-based method to improve the learning. So I have seen many community members saying that local youths are being skilled in this session, and our young people are learning in the village. They are seeing arts and games are not only for fun; it's also supporting learning. Thank you.
Okay, hello. I'm going to talk with you all today about my project that was funded by IPRAF, and it's a documentary film, so it's a little bit different than the other presentations. But it's also about the FARC in Colombia, so there's some overlap with Susan's talk. So I'm Colleen Elaine O'Brien. I'm a postdoc researcher in Jena and Saarland in Germany. And I'm going to talk to you about Strangers to Peace. That's the name of the film. We worked on production for the film from 2016 to 2019. It was a very long process. It was a very in-depth process. We spent a huge amount of time with our participants. The movie premiered in March of 2022 at the Miami Film Festival. And since then, it's shown at a bunch of other film festivals around the world, which has been a really nice experience. The film focuses on three main characters or protagonists, as people say in the film world. Their names are Ricardo, Dejana, and Alexandra, so you'll see them throughout this presentation. Our methods were ethnography and cinema verite. So the movie, rather than trying to explain the Colombian peace process, rather focuses on the individual lives of these two people. So basically, we followed them for years in their day-to-day lives. We hung out with them and their families, with their parents, with their kids, with their lovers, with everybody. We were just like always there in their lives for many hours over a very long period of time. It was a small independent project with basically four of us. So the two directors, Noah DeBonis and Laura Angel, and then me as the producer. And then we had a fourth person, Rajiv, who was a cinematographer in the project as well. And I'll show you some photos. So that's us looking very happy. This is basically what our shoots are like, the three of us behind a camera. Normally I conducted the interview. Laura in the middle, she was kind of the primary cinematographer. And then Noah would do sound or whatever. We all kind of did everything throughout this process. And that's us again in one of the FARC camps or communities, Tierra Grata, with Rajiv as well. And so it was basically, the four of us filming. And it was, as you can see, it's pretty invasive, so the people always knew we were there. We always had two cameras and we put mics on them. It wasn't just like a small production with phones or something. It was very intense. But before I go into more details about the film, I'll give you a little bit of context about the Colombian armed conflict. It's the longest continuous armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere. Over 250,000 people have died, over 6 million have been displaced. The largest armed group is the FARC. And throughout the presentation, most of the photos are from our film or from footage for the film that didn't actually go into the film. So this photo we took in the FARC camp before the people gave up their weapons. And it's a bunch of, FARC women at the beginning of demobilization. So you probably already know who the FARC is. They're like a large guerrilla group in Colombia, and then they started their demobilization process in the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. And that's when we began our project. It was in mid-2016, before the peace process actually started. And this is a photo of a rally in Bogota in support of the peace process. And these are some photos from the camp that we worked in, primarily in Tierra Grata. Again, in the top right corner, you see them before they gave up their weapons, and then later on, after they'd given them up. Because in the demobilization process, basically they all arrived there with their weapons and lived there for a while with the weapons, and then kind of gave them up over time in stages. And this is where the camp was located, in the northern part of Colombia. But it's important to note that before the FARC demobilized, a lot of people demobilized individually. Also, as Susan said, the government had programs to get people to leave the FARC and other armed groups and return to society through individual programs before the FARC demobilized together collectively as a group. So in our project, we worked with both categories of ex-combatants. We worked with ones who were individually reintegrating before the peace process, and we also worked with the ones who were collectively reincorporating as part of the peace process. And with the ones who were individually reintegrating, they did it through this Agency of Colombia for Reintegration, which always has these fun little cartoons. If you watch my film, you can see one of the cartoons in there too. and they have like a route of how they do it, and they follow that, and it's a very individual process rather than a collective one. So before I go on, I'm going to show you the trailer of the film if it works. Again, you can see how invasive the filmmaking is there. This is one of the ex-combatants, Alexandra, while she's packing for a trip. So let's see if this works.
Tenía 13 años cuando vi la guerra. Era una pelada que intentaba escaparse. Matarla no fue fácil. Sufrí bastante, pero
I also have it loaded here, which will maybe be better.
tenía 13 años cuando vi la guerra. Era una pelada que intentaba escaparse. Matarla no fue fácil. Sufrí bastante por eso.
Yo sí te conté porque yo tenía 14, 15 años cuando el profesor yo les enseño a hacer expresiones. Ya es como tengo una hija de compañera.
Dentro de la organización es un delito ser homosexual. Entonces, a juzgar a la persona y a fusilar.
Que tenía que ocultarlo por 20 años, que fueron un martirio.
Estaba pensando que me gustaría ir donde mi mamá.
Y me puede llevar.
¿Y si te secuestran allá?
¿Tu hija va a saber tu historia?
No sé. Se le dio que nosotros vivimos, no la puedes vivir tampoco. Siento que no.
Nha không 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 nhà tôi sợ tôi em nên đây mà có ba mà cũng là phải không
Es que quiero contarle una verdad.
¿Usted ha llegado a tocar a una persona o a lastimarla?
No es fácil llegar a la sociedad y que entiendan que uno en realidad no es un monstruo.
Okay, that's the trailer for the film. So now you have an idea of who the three main people are: Alexandra, Dejana, or Javier, and Ricardo. So just a couple of lessons that I learned while making this film. I mean, some of them are kind of obvious, some of them perhaps less so, but I'm going to discuss them through the context of our characters and the filmmaking process. So most of the people that I interviewed about how they joined the FARC, actually all of them framed it as their own decision. Even if they joined when they were 11 or 12, they were like, I chose to join the FARC. None of them said that they were recruited forcibly. None of them said that they were convinced to do it against their will. All of them framed it as their own decision, which is interesting in terms of like agency and such and empowerment. The people, the family and friends of the people, because obviously during this process we spent a huge amount of time with the ex-combatants themselves, but we also spent a huge amount of time with their family and friends. And their family and friends seem to value reconciliation the most if the person admitted that they did something wrong. So the ex-combatants who were kind of more in denial about what they had done or wouldn't talk about it openly, that definitely caused issues with their friends and families. And that's very clearly shown in our film as well. And then the third thing, which I didn't realize when I first started, but it became clear very quickly, is that ex-combatants who demobilized before the peace process individually have very different challenges from those reintegrating now as a group. For some reason, I and a lot of other people that I knew thought that it would be a very similar experience, but it's very much not. So with this idea of whose decision is it, so I'm gonna go through each of those a little bit individually. Like Alexandra, she joined the FARC when she was 11 because her mother was abusive and she decided to run away and join the FARC. And she very much views it as her decision. She left because she was not happy. And the fact that she was 11, I mean, for me, it's like you're 11, it wasn't your choice, you're a kid. But for her, she made that choice and it was her form of agency to escape abuse. Ricardo too joined pretty young, he was 14, and his teacher recruited him from his high school, but he also views himself as ideological even as a very, very young person, and that the armed group was appealing to him because of his ideology, which he had even before he joined, even before the age 14, like when he was 12, he saw himself as Marxist. This idea of value of remorse or guilt in the reconciliation processes comes out a lot with Dajana, the trans woman. So she wanted very much to tell her friends who were also trans women about her past, and she finally did, which was great. But then they also wanted to talk with her about what she had done in the conflict and her role in the FARC, and she would not admit that she had done anything wrong. And in the end, her friends stopped talking to her entirely because Dajana just kind of went on this incoherent rant about how she would shoot guns in the distance but never actually saw anyone get killed. And through this conversation, her friend is just like, okay, so you didn't see it, so you didn't do it, and is very disturbed by that. So whereas some of the other people I think do talk more openly about what they did and apologize for it more directly. And then these differences between past and current reintegration, all of the people who are demobilizing now as part of the peace process, they're still part of the group, like Susan talked about. So like all of these women in this photo, at least for the times that I went to their community, they still very much identified as FARC, whereas the ones who reintegrated individually obviously are not part of it anymore and have more issues with whether or not they can still relate to the ideology or not. And then finally, there's some benefits, I think, of filmmaking as a method, that I just haven't gotten in other types of research. I'm not a filmmaker by training in any way. I think that there are a lot of insights that you might not get otherwise. The way you spend time with people is really different if you're filming with them all day, every day, and then trying to get information from interviews in order to put together a coherent narrative, and also trying to force them to let you hang out with people in their lives, which you might not do just if you're doing normal ethnography or anthropology, but we very much wanted to be as much in their lives as possible. There are also these kind of collaborative methods and ways of narrative making, which I found interesting. As the project went on, we would talk with them more what do you want us to film? So it wasn't always just we're fly on the wall sitting there while they're doing whatever they normally do, but also it'd be okay, tell us something that you want to do, and then we'll film that. And so, for example, Dajana wanted to tell her friends about her past, and so she was like, let's do it on top of Montserrat in Bogota. So she wanted us to film her telling her friends on top of this beautiful mountain with a view of Bogota underneath. And that's what she wanted to do. And we're like, okay, we'll do it, of course. That's why you want to tell your friends about your past as an ex-combatant. That's what we'll do. Also, Ricardo, he wanted to show his past in the FARC through him getting drunk alone in my apartment one night and putting on a balaclava. So we did that too, and that's in the film. So you can see him just drinking beer and watching old videos of himself throwing bombs at cops and discussing it. And that was how he thought it would be good to portray the link between his past and present. Okay, that's all. So feel free to contact me if you want to talk about my film. And thank you all for coming.
We have time for a few questions. Does anybody have any questions? Scholars?
Thank you all very much for these presentations. Super interesting and a lot of threads connecting them, but I guess I just wanted to ask one question on the FARC, and I wanted to hear a little bit about what y'all thought about the dissolution or unraveling of the FARC's political party based on this kind of collective emphasis that exists within the organization as such, right? Like, they talk a lot about the FARC culture, cultura fariana and things like that. But if you look at what's happening right now, it seems so far away from the possibility that existed in like 2016, right? So anyway, that's what I was curious about. Thank you.
You want to take this? You want to ask one, add to that, okay?
Just a few questions. Is there any relationship between, or at least it's kind of inspiration maybe, between the Saturday Mothers and the Madres Club de Mayo, from Argentina?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I think you're absolutely right that at the national level, the FARC as a collective project is very much fragmented. And I think that in my interviews with the ex-combatants in the spaces, I was surprised to find that even within territorial spaces where folks tend to have a strong FARC identity, there was a lot of dissent and a lot of criticism of the former high command, now leaders of the party. And that dissent, in fact, one space in Honduras and La Guajira has entirely separated itself from the party. But then there were also folks who supported it. And oddly, they would say they were members, but that they didn't like it, right? And the main criticisms were that they felt that when they were an armed organization, that they were a grassroots project, that they had an ideology strongly tied to the communities, and that once they had transitioned into a party, it kind of fell to like the iron law of oligarchy of political parties, right? Where it became very top down. So that was the first complaint. And they also felt that their leaders had sold them out, that they weren't using their political power to advocate on behalf of the rank and file that had sacrificed decades of their lives for the movement. They were in Bogota, they were enjoying good food and lived in nice apartments and had security, and these people were in the rural areas working with the communities and being shot at, was basically the sentiment. And then the last thing that they would say is that they felt, well, those were the two main complaints, and that they felt that they would be better off just sort of having more local projects that were connected to the communities that they felt they fought for. So there was those components, and yet oddly they would still say, but I'm a member of the party after all of that, right? And there were still some that actually wouldn't say any of that, and they were political militants. So it's very divided at the local level. I still think there's an important political component to collective reintegration, but I think it is very much a local one for now. I don't think the party is viable. I don't know what that means for the political space on the left. But I think that these ex-combatants are better off to sort of find new alliances if they want to be competitive at the national level.
No, I agree.
I just want to point out something that, about the IPRA Foundation and what we fund. Here we have two projects related to FARC, completely different projects. And I think that shows some of the variety of the things that the foundation does. Do you want to respond to the question? Peter.
Thank you very much. I didn't see anything that said they deliberately took inspiration from the environmental movement. They mostly explained it as they came together and they wanted to take a stand and they decided to hold these cities. But there is definitely a link of, there are some connections and there's a solidarity link between the two groups. So some of the mothers were activists from the Saturday Mothers People movement, which go to Argentina, for example, and they would support the mothers from the mothers, and it is also it works the other way around. So there are some like pictures that they got together. For example, if it's an important day in Turkey, then some like very symbolic figures of mothers would come to Turkey. And even now, so Saturday mothers are not allowed to go on Galatasaray Square anymore since their 700 week. So it's been a long time that they're not allowed to hold their regions there. They do it somewhere different, which is not too far from the square, but it's not the same place. And they face police violence every week, almost, especially this recent weeks. Every Saturday there is news that the activists are arrested and then they are released after a couple of hours, but this happened even today, this morning. So when there is this increased police violence, for example, Plaza de Mayo mothers would release a press statement of solidarity. So there are all these strong connections between other groups as well, but also with them. And also from outside, many people would make those things and how they are very similar to them. It's they're using very similar tools and strategies. But I don't know if at the beginning they told this is the way to go. I don't know how they.
All right, thank you. I have two brief questions. One for the Southern mothers. I'm interested in the overall impact of the movement in terms of, for example, you said, most of them use pictures, right, of those who have disappeared. So my question there is this in any way reduced the kidnappings, especially when they use photos? Is this an impact in terms of, reducing the number of kidnappings over time? And then the other one is for the citizen-led education. My question there is the end product. What happens after the students get through the process? What happens then after? Do they get formalized into formal education? Or I'm not so sure. I'm wondering, what do you do next after the kids learn the basics?
I think there are so many things that can happen after next. So one, when we are focusing on communities, working with children, those who are not able to even have basic proficiency, here the target is only to uplift them up to that level. After that, I think it's up to them. If they are in school, they can minister back to school, or they can go to school, or somebody maybe might not want to go to school, that's fine, because they will choose their own path. So we are not there to determine like where they should go. So our only role is that to ensure that when they have, like they reach age of 16, at least all children should be able to do that minimum proficiency level performance. That's the only, I think, target here now.
Just have time for one answer. There's another plenary here in 15 minutes, so go ahead.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't have time to talk about it, but normally if I have time to go over the other slides, it's part of my analysis of how they contributed to transition justice pillars. And when I talk about guarantees of non-recurrence, I talk about how they play the preventive role in terms of preventing further disappearances. And it's really hard to tell if this was only due to their efforts, because how can we know really? But when there was the enforced disappearances, where they were very widespread during the 90s, the Kurdish region was also under the state of emergency. So that state of emergency was lifted at some point. So like the main reason probably why we didn't have, like we only had this a couple of years that were enforced disappearances were really common, because there was that state of emergency. But the activists of Saturday Mothers movement, they do think they played a preventive role. And in my interviews, they were telling me that they would hear from other families or people who were taken into custody, and then the police officers would say, well, if we do something to you now, or if we torture you, then your family would go to Galatasaray Square, and all the press would be there, so okay, we won't do anything. These are individual accounts, so I don't know on a larger scope how effective it was. I really don't know how to measure it, but it was, I think it's a very important question. And they also, another interview was telling me that this is one of the things that they feel very proud of because they lost their loved ones already, but the reason why they still go on that square for this 28 years now is because they don't want this to happen again, and they want to make sure that this will never ever happen to anyone else in Turkey, not only Kurdish activists or left-wing activists, but the state policy should continue in this way. And they do think they played an important role. And I do think they played an important role as well, because everyone knows about them. It's a very legitimate movement in many people, not only for like politicized people, but they do get a lot of support from different actors. So I do think they did play a pivotal role.
Thank you, everybody, and feel free to talk to these scholars around afterwards.